Today, we're going to start our unit on genetics and genetic disorders. This will actually cover two chapters. It will cover chapter 11 and chapter 14. We're going to begin today with section 1 of chapter 11, and we're going to begin talking about the works of Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel was a monk who studied pea plants, and he is actually known for his study of genetics. He is what we would consider the father of modern genetics. When we talk about what genetics is, every living thing has a set of characteristics that were inherited from its parent or parents. If we are talking about asexual reproduction, it is only one parent. If we are talking about sexual reproduction, it is parents. And what our genetics is it is what is passed from one generation to another generation. And the delivery of those characteristics from parent to offspring is called heredity. The study of heredity is known as genetics. And your genetics is what makes you individual. Genetics is what makes each organism unique. And Gregor Mendel is the person who is responsible for beginning our modern study of genetics. He was an Australian monk. He used garden pea plants. He used those for multiple different reasons. They're easy to grow, they grow quickly, they're small, and they can give him lots and lots of offspring. And what he would do in his experiments is he would do cross-pollination. And cross-pollination is where we take pollen from one plant and we put it onto another plant. And he controlled this by removing the parts of the plant so that they didn't pollinate on their own. And in this way, he was able to monitor and follow and try to figure out what the offsprings would look like when he did these cross pollinations. In his experiment, he called the first generation the P generation, or the parent generation. The offspring from that first generation was the F1 generation, or the first filial generation. And the second generation was called the F2, or the second filial generation. Some genetic terms that we need to make sure that we are aware of is we need to know the term allele. Allele is a different version of a gene. So like if we're talking about eye color, it would be like brown, blue, green, gray, hazel. Those are different versions of a gene. Dominant is the expressed form of a trait. So dominant is like what we see. Dominant alleles are always indicated by a capital letter. Recessive traits are traits that we may not necessarily see if a dominant trait is present. In order for a recessive trait to be expressed or seen, you must have two recessive traits. An example of this would be blue eyes. Blue eyes is a recessive trait. You have to have two genes for blue eyes in order to have blue eyes. Recessive alleles are expressed by writing it with a lowercase letter. So we use a lowercase letter to represent recessive traits and a capital letter to represent dominant traits. It's too far, sorry. Dominance. When we talk about dominance, there are two things that we could have. So we could have an organism with the same alleles. So two small letters, little b, or big B. They have the same allele for a particular trait. They are called homozygous. An allele with an organism with two different alleles for a particular trait is called heterozygous. So big B, little b, they're opposites. You have one dominant and one recessive trait that is considered heterozygous. Important terms to know are genotype and phenotype. Genotype is the allele pairs. They are what we represent in letters. They are the gene form. Phenotype is the physical expression of the allele. So that is like what we actually see. The phenotype, if you think phenotype, think physical, and it is words describing what we see. So if you look at the picture here, you will see the phenotype is blue eyes. The phenotype is brown eyes. The genotype for blue eyes is little b, little b. The genotype for brown eyes is big B, little b, or big B, big B. So the genotype for brown eyes could be heterozygous, big B, little b, or homozygous, big B, big B. Mendel also was able to determine what he referred to as the law of segregation. And this is that two alleles for each trait separate during meiosis, which is what we're going to be talking about again later in this chapter. It builds off of mitosis that we learned last chapter. Those two alleles separate during meiosis. So they separate so that you only get one from each parent, one allele from each parent. During fertilization, those two alleles come back together and unite. Another word for a heterozygous organism is also called a hybrid. Think like hybrid cars. They run on gas and electricity. They are hybrids. That ends section 1. If you have any question on section 1, please make sure to ask me.